I think there could come a time in the not too distant future where he may want to step away, perhaps others too, in the administration, if they want a shred of credibility left after they leave the White House.
Hi, I'm James Heapy, and this is Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. This morning, I am joined by Michael Bossack, a journalist, a commentator, and a fellow at the Atlantic Council, who has a wide experience of Ukraine and a fantastic understanding of geopolitics and security in the region. He's also Canadian, and so some interesting opportunities to discuss the relationship between Canada and the US as well. Michael, welcome. Last weekend you wrote in your opinion piece for the New York Times around the Ukrainian readiness to host elections again, which has been a thing that has come up in Washington over the last few weeks, and people expecting that to happen. But you reflect that whilst martial law is imposed, that's simply unrealistic. So I wonder, what is the route to reopening Ukrainian democracy and establishing a post-war society, assuming that all of the ceasefire and peace negotiations that are in the process at the moment were to succeed?
Fantastic to be with you. Thank you for having me. Well, of course, all of this depends, too, on when a ceasefire, an enduring peace will come. I mean, over the past not only 3 years, 11 years, Russia has been very, very busy. Russia's and its proxies trying to plunge Ukraine into failed state status. As you well know, millions of Ukrainians are overseas. A lot of people are continuing to leave or thinking of leaving. A lot of infrastructure has been bombed to shreds, including the energy and more recently the railway infrastructure. So a lot of the pieces that would make up a vibrant democracy either aren't there or in tatters right now. And to give people a kind of visualization of the state of democracy in Ukraine, which is, of course, very, very strong after decades of effort, is if you walk by the headquarters of the Central Election Commission in Kiev, it's totally dark. It's been turned into something else for the time being. So all of these basic tools of democracy need to be put back into place. But as I pointed out in that piece, compared to many other countries, and because I'm in the neighborhood, I'll reference Turkey. We saw what happened 2 days ago. Protests have been banned after the president went after his opponents, including the mayor of Istanbul. Well, in Ukraine, demonstrations and protests have been tolerated. I've seen many happen without any interruption from the police. No one thrown into jail, no one told to go home. So those types of methods of freedom of expression are alive and well. Having said that, I mean, there are concerns about the office of the president clamping down quite a bit on media freedom. For example, right at the beginning of the war, President Zelensky mandated what's called the 24/7 telemarathon, where the 5 main channels grouped together and did a rolling broadcast. But it's all pretty much advertising free. It's all very positive towards the president and as one would expect towards the military, but it's done away with a lot of competition. It's absolutely ruined the digital marketing space, well, the marketing space altogether. So media entities are having a tough time generating revenue. And even for investigative journalists, it can be tough whether they're reporting on the office of the president or on powerful oligarchs. Under the chief of staff of the office of the president, Andriy Yermak, who's very powerful, criticism is not tolerated. Now, of course, during wartime, we might expect that, but given we're 3 years into the war, and this is, I bring this up because I have long argued, and so have colleagues of mine who are Ukrainian journalists, that in order for the reconstruction, rebuilding of Ukraine to happen, the first block that needs to be put into place is a free and vibrant media because, James, the last time I checked, business people, investors require on, independent, verifiable information about what's going on. In addition, they would like to see a check on corruption. Those are the 2 main roles that the media provides. I cannot tell you, I mean, we're talking about the state of the Ukrainian state, but the media has been really devastated, not only by physical bombing, but displacement of journalists overseas or to the front line. As I said, lack of revenues. A lot have been killed or injured, and newsrooms have been destroyed as well. So a lot of rebuilding to do there. So if the Ukrainian government were to redraw their blueprints for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which they should be doing right now, of course, media needs to be the first step there. And finally, on this one, I think that the president and his office should be looking at a couple of things. One is zones of normality, if you will, perhaps in Western Ukraine, Lviv, places like that. I've talked to officials there. There's still martial law there. They're saying, well, there's not much use for it anymore. They're begging, and I'm telling you, begging for airspace to be open in the far western parts of Ukraine where the war seems distant. After all, you know, we've seen Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv and the airport in Beirut operate under very difficult circumstances. I can bet you that airlines are willing to take that risk, and so are some passengers. But that, because when you have, as you well know, a martial law regime, it affects business as well. They don't want to come, or insurance won't cover them, the risk insurance. And then, yeah, on the elections, maybe allow some sort of local elections to take place in the western regions again, just to stress test the election system. But no way, I've talked to experts, no way when it comes to parliamentary or presidential elections. That's what Russia wants. They want regime change. They will do all they can to disrupt or to manipulate. So that part of the puzzle just isn't on right now.
I mean, it seems that there's therefore sort of three issues. There's the sort of physical capacity to deliver elections, you know, the absence of the election regulator, the destruction, the collapse of Ukraine's free media, which is essential to the sort of the discourse that comes with an election. So issue number one, that's a sort of practical thing to rebuild and takes time. Secondly, the appropriateness of it, and I do think from listening to your answer there that people in Washington forget that if the US was in a war of national survival against an existential threat, the US would similarly clamp down on unhelpful media that gives succor to the enemy or sort of does anything other than reinforce the national will to fight. That is inherent to war, yes. And we shouldn't be quick to try and impose our kind of peacetime expectations of political and democratic norms onto a country that is fighting for its survival. But the third thing is that there is this acute risk that if you hold elections too soon, or you might even argue whenever they are held in Ukraine, it will be an open door for Russia to fight a war in Ukraine through other means, through a flood of subversive activity and disinformation, and everything that the Russian army has failed to achieve over the last 3 years, the GRU, through their disinformation campaign, may well succeed yet. Michael, I wonder how we, when is that moment? You know, the UK did not hold elections during the Second World War, and it takes time for a society to recover from war. When is the moment when Ukraine sort of can get back to normality?
Sure. And we might add that even during peacetime, what we're seeing happening in the Trump White House to media, you know, banning media outlets, that sort of stuff. But we can talk about that later. But I should say that the experts I've spoken to say a minimum of a year in terms of preparations to get the whole system ready. And then, of course, there are other couple of things here. You have, a huge amount of men and women serving on the front lines. They wouldn't be able to vote under these types of conditions. And then you have the millions of Ukrainians overseas. Because of budget cuts over the years, Ukrainian diplomatic posts are in no shape whatsoever to process the voting, to undertake a voting exercise involving millions of Ukrainians. Absolutely not. So, and then you have to remember that you have Ukrainians in the occupied zones. If you held an election, say tomorrow, they would be in effect disenfranchised because they wouldn't be able to cross the line. So, first step, of course, too, you need these solid lines of where Ukrainian territory is, where can election missions go. And then, of course, you have to have a credible election. I've served as an election observer many times. You have to have election observers who are independent and credible. They need access, as we did as the OSCE in 2014, 2015. And that is agreed to by both sides. So, especially when you're involved in areas closer to the front line, where it's a lot easier for the Russians to get up to their shenanigans. Observers need to be there. Under the current conditions, there's no way you get sufficient observers to sign up to go to those parts. But there's also, I think, the symbolism, if you will, that's involved in holding an election. That is, of course, a big signal to the world that we are reaching a state of normalcy. But that cannot happen again until there's a credible, long-lasting ceasefire.
You also touched in your opinion piece on corruption in the Ukrainian system. And again, just as we've heard over recent months, the sort of the Ukraine skeptic wing in Washington criticized the lack of elections, they've also, throughout the war, really, been very focused on the corruption and whether or not Ukraine is a trustworthy partner for Ukrainian aid, with all sorts of allegations of embezzlement and enrichment. How overblown are those allegations, and how committed is Zelensky to rooting them out? Because, as you know, he started well, but one might argue that the effort has lacked fervour since.
Yeah, before the war, pretty close to actually the start of the war, Zelensky was criticized, including by the G7 ambassadors in Kiev, for slowing down judicial reform. It's really a key piece of the whole puzzle to root out corruption. But and I've long since argued war should not give you a pass to put aside the fight against corruption. Why? In my opinion, because those millions who left are watching what's going on in Ukraine very carefully. And I've talked to many, I've watched many of their YouTube videos, and they make it clear, they do not want to return to an old Ukraine where corruption is the rules the day. So what has happened under wartime measures is that two procurement agencies have been established, one for lethal, one for non-lethal. But of course, that opens the door to single source procurement. And there have been some mega scandals, overpriced foodstuffs, things like that. But the president has said we will go after them, and he's even suggested during war. A lot of people would probably suggest that these guys need to be shot, which I agree. But the problem as well, kind of in the background in Ukraine, I've checked, for example, some of the mandatory sentences or minimum sentences that are handed down for multi-million-dollar stealing, and it's 10 years, 12 years, maybe maximum 20. I'd suggest a lot of people would be willing to take the risk if, it's basically a slap on the hand. Basic things like that. But I think Ukraine has come a long way. Sadly, one of the really impressive roots of progress Ukraine has had is digitization. There's an app most Ukrainians have on their phone called DIA, D-I-I-A, and there you have, basically President Zelensky has said, I want the nation on the smartphone. So you have your passport, driver's license. I don't know if you're married or not, but if you're Ukrainian and you fancy somebody, you can actually propose to them through this app and take care of most of the bureaucratic stuff. So what that does is that roots out the middleman and chances for corruption, all of that stuff. And, when people have to flee in a hurry, they don't have to obsess over paper documents. They have it in their smartphones. So, but because of the cuts of USAID, it's really slowed that process of digitization, things like mine awareness as well. And that's sad because Ukraine was really an example to the world in terms of this. In fact, they were already starting to export that technology elsewhere.
I mean, it strikes me as you speak that there's a really interesting, at the moment, the challenge of rooting out corruption in a wartime economy under martial law is one thing, but even that has caused moments when military aid has been withheld on the basis that there was concern that within the MOD there was embezzlement and mispurposing of lethal aid. What's to follow in Ukraine is an enormous reconstruction effort within which billions, if not trillions, of dollars and euros will flow into the country. And that challenge for Zelensky of securing Ukrainian democracy and trust in Ukrainian state institutions, whilst 1,000 different lines of efforts with trillions of dollars of aid and investment, inward investment flowing in, will be acutely challenging. And I wonder whether people should be prepared for, if you hold him to an impossible standard, if you hold the Ukrainian government to an impossible standard, they simply won't succeed, and that the intent is what should be looked for rather than the success in delivery.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, even before the war, there were a lot of voices saying that the government, whether it was Zelensky or his predecessor Poroshenko, were being held to an impossible standard. That, this is a relatively young democracy, and it has a very strong enemy on its border. As you well know, as a former minister, Russia's gray zone or hybrid warfare has been an overdrive over the years. So this is a key potential disruptor of all of those processes. So yes, on the one hand, you have to have a very earnest drive towards rooting out corruption. But on the other hand, even when the bullets aren't flying, you have a lot. I mean, for example, I remember when I was seconded by Canada to the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, we had a massive cyber attack that disrupted a lot of the functioning of government. And it showed that, the government just doesn't have the not proper cyber defenses to defend itself. And the other problem right now, so that people keep their expectations down, is that there's an enormous, and I put it in capital letters, enormous labor shortage right now in Ukraine. So to staff all of these state institutions that root out corruption, to get enough police officers, watchdogs, that sort of thing, it's very, very difficult.
Can I ask you to reflect on two things, both of which we've touched on. Firstly, what is going to happen next from Putin's perspective? You rightly noted in your commentary of late that Zelensky's had a good week. He's recovered from his car crash meeting in the Oval Office, yes. and
good way to put it.
Signed up to Trump's proposal. So the ball is now in Putin's court. What does Putin do?
Well, James, it must be like 10 Christmases in the Kremlin right now with all the concessions that the United States has given, with Mr. Putin having given very, very little in return. I could picture him right now sitting back looking very smug and happy at what's going on. He very skillfully, as I wrote, played his trump card and manipulated Mr. Trump to get the absolute minimum from that phone call the two of them had the other day. Some vague promise of a partial ceasefire, depending on whose readout. From the Russian perspective, we won't strike energy. From the U.S. side, it says energy and infrastructure. But after the call after the call with Zelensky, something very bizarre came up where Mr. Trump suggested that the U.S. take ownership of all of the power plants, conventional and nuclear, in Ukraine. We're talking, I believe, 4 nuclear power plants if you include that occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That really threw people off. We don't know where that came from, and now there's no talk of the rare earth minerals deal. But it all seems that, to me at least, that the sun is shining brightly on Mr. Putin in the Kremlin, because from my perspective, what I'm seeing is the gradual partition of Ukraine let's see what assets could be given away, bargained away, or maybe grabbed by a very transactional president. And it almost seems to me that they're moving towards rewarding Russia for 11 years of war, with them not having to give much in return. You well know, I bet you can spot it too when the Kremlin issues statements or Mr. Putin speaks. They talk about working groups and, going to Saudi Arabia to talk things out. But this is all code for slowing things down. I believe, and I've spoken as recently yesterday evening informally with friends here in Moldova, they agree with me and they fear this, is that Mr. Putin will go for the max. So what does that mean? That means crossing the banks of the Dnipro River in the south, going through the remainder of Kherson Oblast up to Mykolaiv, up to where I'm based, Odessa, where you have World Port Odessa, which helps feed the world, up to the Moldova border and beyond. And my Moldovan friends pointed out to me that if that were to happen, Moldova basically has no defenses to push them back. It would be 100% up to the Ukrainians to defend Moldova. So this is a big, big concern. And I raise this at every opportunity I can because I don't think the Europeans take this seriously enough. I think they're scrambling to get their act together. Well, not only Europeans, UK and also Canada and others. These are, when you're in a period like right now, where you have this void, where you have no solid red lines being enforced by the United States, it's the perfect time for an autocrat like Mr. Putin to go for the max and grab territory. And one more thing, I mean, shortly after the call that was hailed as historic and high stakes, the call between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, the firing resumed within hours. With Russia striking very, very heavily Ukraine, of course, retaliating. And then the other day after the call with Zelensky, the White House press secretary, in her arrogance and self-assuredness, said, we've never been closer to peace, and this is due to the credit of Mr. Trump. Well, yet again, heavy firing between the two sides. So that's where we are right now. James, it's a beautiful sunny day in this part of the world, extending all the way to southern Ukraine. But when I talk to my Ukrainian friends, I ask them, how do you feel? They say, all we see in front of us is darkness at the moment.
I fear you're right. And your point about there's a new complacency in Europe at the moment. There's been a complacency before the February 2022 renewal of hostilities that Russia was parked, that the Crimea was an aberration, and that complacency has been proven wrong. Correct. There's complacency around US commitment to the continent and the fact that meant that European countries could all get a cheaper ride when it came to defence and security. Mm-hmm. That complacency is gone. But bizarrely, the new complacency is that that Trump will definitely get a deal that will hold. And therefore, what Europe needs to do is think about simply maintaining whatever deal is done. And I agree with you that Putin doesn't see it that way. Putin sees that there is nothing being asked of him in return, really. He can set out a set of maximalist demands. And last week on Superpowers, we were joined by Heather Conley, the former Assistant Secretary of State in the George W. Bush State Department. And she made a really interesting point. In the Trump 1 presidency, he thought he could sort North Korea. Yep. And so he did the engagements, he had the summit. And then when the North Koreans didn't play ball, it wasn't some moment of great failure and introspection. It was just ignored and moved on to whatever was next. Yep. And I've been reflecting on that all week, because the reality is that if Trump gets bored of a process that Putin continues to kick down the road, and it becomes apparent that he's not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize winning moment that he hoped for, he'll just move on to something else and leave the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Russians to their own devices. And I therefore share very much your view of the sort of that this is not yet the end game, and that some very dark days could be ahead. And your Moldovan point is very, very well made. I can well imagine.
James, sorry if I could jump in. Also, it seems to me this is kind of foreign policy making on the fly that we're seeing from the White House. And, under those 10 Christmases tree in the Kremlin, what we're seeing are beautiful gifts from the United States that Russia probably didn't even ask for. And that's, for example, the dismantling of that Yale University lab that very assiduously documents the cases of forcibly kidnapped Ukrainian children into Russia. We see the United States very quietly stepping away from a multinational effort to investigate the war in Ukraine, including Mr. Putin. We see Russia being allowed to send its diplomats, probably a lot of spies, back into the United States. Many other things, and of course, the defunding of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which I've described as the digital Berlin Wall against the digital Berlin Wall against Russian disinformation. This was celebrated in the Kremlin by, for example, the head of Russia Today and others. So it's just hard to comprehend why this is happening, and again, with Russia giving so little in return.
I'd like to jump across the pond and think about what's going on in Washington for a second. And we've seen Elon Musk come under some pressure this week from major investors in Tesla. So, so he's under some pressure. Yeah. Marco Rubio could not look more uncomfortable if he tried. What started as a resurgent Trump turn, all the talk was about they've assembled a team this time, learnt the lessons from the last one, where the team is ultra loyal, ultra committed. Yeah. I wonder whether or not there's already some fracture creeping into that top team.
I brought that up in my previous Times Radio interview that I'd like to put my best faith in Mr. Rubio. I think he is, at the end of the day, a man of credibility. He has said positive things about Ukraine in the past. And when you look at him sit there, especially during that boxing match in the Oval Office the other day, very, very uncomfortable, looks humiliated, embarrassed about what's happening. I think there could come a time in the not too distant future where he may want to step away, perhaps others too, in the administration, if they want a shred of credibility left after they leave the White House. But, and also you have to think when Rubio and his team show up in a place like Saudi Arabia and make deals with the Russians, they know very well it's up to the big boss at the end of the day, who's very prone to changing his mind. But even more so, is very transactional. What do I get out of it? What does my family get out of it? What does the United States get out of it? Forgetting that a lot of the structures, the security structures that have been built up over the decades are also meant to protect the United States. As with viruses, wars take very little to fly across the oceans and affect another population, and they don't see it coming. So these are very, very dangerous times in that regard. And I have to mention something else, going back to that White House press briefing I referenced a few moments ago. I was listening very carefully, and it seems to me, and this might be a controversial thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, it seems to me the kind of narrative and the actions coming out of that White House seem more Kremlin-esque. When you hear the White House press secretary, for example, refer to people who storm Tesla dealerships as domestic terrorists, when you refer to the U.S. Institute for Peace, which, by the way, included a lot of former fine U.S. diplomats like Bill Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to here. People may remember that name. He testified before Congress in the quid pro quo scandal. When fine, experienced people who really care about world peace are referred to by the White House as rogue bureaucrats, we are in a very, very dark age. And again, by their actions, dismantling these very, very important institutions that were built over the past decades to advance the cause of peace, And the big one, of course, USAID. Since the start of the war, Ukraine was the biggest recipient to the tune of about $36 billion. To just blow that up overnight is having a real impact, not only in Ukraine, but around the world. And again, I will reemphasize this, in this day and age when we're so interconnected, especially by air travel, it doesn't take much for deadly viruses, for example, which a lot of them were prevented by USAID funding from crossing the ocean and affecting Americans. They just don't get it.
I agree, and the isolationism that seems so in vogue is going to come at, over time, enormous cost to America. The world has not changed profoundly since the last episode of US isolationism. The way the global economy now operates means that you just can't retreat to within your own borders. And the vacuum that is being created in international affairs by the withdrawal of USAID funding, the reduced US global military ambition beyond their efforts to contain China. All of that will be taken advantage of by Russia, China, and others who will seek to recast a global order in a way that is more beneficial to them and therefore at the expense of the US interest. I guess as much as people like me are gravely concerned around what US isolationism does for a new world order, it's worth qualifying to you as a Canadian that isolationism is not entirely isolated within the borders of the United States, and that the United States' near neighbours, particularly Mexico and Canada, are enjoying a very different relationship with Washington at the moment. What is Mark Carney, newly appointed, I think full of confidence and seeing an uptick in his popularity as a consequence of the way that he's approached this. What of US-Canada relations? I mean, how sour can this all turn?
Yeah, great question. Well, if I could start very quickly with a zooming out kind of answer to that, I think where things are heading right now is we seem to be speaking of a very transactional Mr. Trump to a kind of state of the world where things are going to be divided hemispherically. Mr. Trump focusing on North America mostly, giving free rein, and it seems we're headed that way, to Mr. Putin to have sway over this part of the world, and then Xi Jinping in China. I hope to go to Taiwan soon and take a kind of reading there of how folks feel, but I bet they feel very anxious like people in Ukraine do, because there's growing doubts as to whether Mr. Trump will honor U.S. commitments to defend Taiwan should Xi Jinping make his move. But as for Canada, look, before relocating here, I was based on Vancouver Island. I lived in a border town where we had a U.S. Customs and Immigration post. We had twice-a-day ferries to the United States. And when COVID-19 came, it just severed that direct human contact we had with our American friends. We relied so much on Americans coming and staying with us and spending and so on. Very, very intertwined. I woke up every morning seeing in the distance Mount Washington and a reminder of how close we are. And, for the most part, in big kind of tragedies like COVID-19 pandemic, Canada worked in lockstep with the United States because we knew we were so interconnected. Man-made borders, as you well know, don't stop viruses and things like that. But who would have thought that we'd be at the day where many Canadians are looking at the United States as a predator, as almost an enemy, when you have more than once Mr. Trump calling the former Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, the governor, calling Canada the 51st state. It goes beyond that. Many people may not know this, but the administration is reportedly looking, for example, at rewriting decades-old agreements about water sharing in the Great Lakes, which we share with them. A lot of people say water is going to be the new war between states, and we happen to have a lot of it in Canada. The United States depends very, very heavily on oil from our biggest oil-producing province of Alberta. If that were to suddenly stop, and the premier there has brought up that possibility, gas prices will go through the roof in the United States. And there's a feeling in Canada right now where, sadly, and we all have very, very, very strong ties, especially human ties with the United States, that the only way the Trump administration is going to get the message is by inflicting pain on them. Already, many premiers have taken matters into their own hands and done everything from clear the liquor shelves of U.S. booze to Doug Ford in Ontario threatening to slap tariffs on electricity exports or cutting it off altogether, putting millions of Americans potentially, if not in the darkness, with higher utility bills. But already this is having an effect on Americans, and I think we're going to be headed to a point in the not too distant future where Mr. Trump and his MAGA team is going to face a very big backlash. For Mr. Carney, who we should remind people, he was sworn in as Prime Minister. He's not elected. He's kind of an interim Prime Minister, expected to call an election this weekend, which will take place in April. But yeah, Mr. Trump's digs at Canada and at the former Prime Minister have given the ruling Liberal Party, of which Mr. Carney is part of, a huge lift. They were very, very much down in the polls. We're now seeing that a lot of that had to do with Mr. Trudeau, not necessarily with the party. But it now looks like they could squeak through with at least a minority government. And we are looking, most Canadians feel we are looking at a scenario where we will be in this for the long term, as long as Mr. Trump is in power, because many of us feel there's no going back on what you just did, especially with tariffs and sinking our Canadian dollar, that Mr. Carney appears best equipped as a former central banker, especially, to deal with this very predatory administration. But once again, a lot of us feel that we have to fight this. It's caused, finally, and good things come out of this too, it has forced Canada to redirect its kind of economic access from north-south to east-west. And the Canadian opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, came up with a very good idea a few days ago. He said, let's help Europe defund the Putin war machine. How do we do that? We rush building of LNG terminals on Canada's east coast to make it easier to ship out our energy to Europe so that they can lessen their reliance on Russian energy. So these types of things are being looked at as well, and it's about time.
Well, I agree. And Canada is a sovereign nation, a G7 nation in its own right, and has every right to chart its own course. And I think that what the Canadian government, the EU Commission, and others who are faced with these tariffs are doing in saying, well, we will respond in kind and impose equal pain on the US economy as you impose on ours, is the only way to stand up to Trump's approach. I suppose my sort of macro concern, therefore, is you can envisage, if it was mooted the other week that Putin should be readmitted to the G7 and it becomes a debate again, and you end up in a situation where you've got within the G8 somebody with whom a Western ally is at war with, China, who has threatened a trade war on the United States, and the rest of the G7 who are in a de facto trade war with the United States already. And that grouping that has underpinned the global order at the highest level for so long ends up being really fractious and divided, and not therefore in any position to solve the world's problems unless they're all able to meet at these at these summits and deal with issues like climate change or the evolution of AI, whilst pretending that they're not all scrapping with each other over tariffs. That feels fanciful to me. It all feels very dangerous, very combustible. And of course, the person who succeeds is Putin, because his narrative all along has been that there should be a return to a global order in which might is right, and everybody just looks after their naked national interest.
Right, like tantrum diplomacy, as I once wrote in an op-ed for CNN. Even under Trump, we saw a lot of that gunboat tantrum diplomacy, but also the Chinese as well. We have to remember, I remember in summits, for example, in Papua New Guinea, where they tried to really strong-arm their way to get statements aligned with their thinking. I think a lot of these summits have become almost anachronisms, because the only way, it seems to me, that they can get any sort of statement together through the work of their Sherpas is to water things down where they have very little meaning. And again, going back to the United States, when in that recent UN resolution and in the Security Council on the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine, where you had the United States watering resolutions down, voting with thug regimes, this is a day we thought that would never come. What the heck is going on there? You know, and I guess it requires other friends of democracy, if we can put it that way, to pick up the mantle and be the shining beacon of democracy, the kind of leader of the free world. I don't know if that can be France under Macron or UK under Sir Keir Starmer, but we need, I think, as a global community, a strong, strong leader to look up to and to defend our values, and of course, to push back what seems like a growing community of thugs. I think I saw a survey the other day where the number of states that are categorized as autocratic have overtaken the number that are seen as non-autocratic. I mean, what a world we live in at the moment, and it almost seems as if Mr. Trump is enabling this process. This is a man, for example, his subservience to Mr. Putin has no floor. He looks up at strong dictators. And if I may, James, I think we've seen that a little bit in these televised Oval Office meetings, this kind of governing by press conference. I was watching carefully when King Abdullah of Jordan was sitting there taking it from Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump saying, yeah, these millions of Gazans can go to Jordan or Egypt. We can turn the Gaza Strip into a Riviera. Those are all red lines for the King of Jordan. He has said very, very clearly, no way to massive displacement of Palestinians. And he just said enough to get by without provoking Mr. Trump, because he well knew that this would go over like a lead balloon, not only in his own country, but the Arab world. We also saw how your Prime Minister handled Mr. Trump by buttering him up. I know I've said this a number of times, people are probably getting bored of this, but I said he buttered him up so much that Mr. Trump's cholesterol level probably went through the roof. But that was brilliant, you know, coming with an invitation from the king. But I think that was diluted a bit by then Mr. Zelensky seeing the king. Mr. Carney has already had an audience with him. Let's see what happens. We have to, of course, hope for the best, but sadly, sitting here in a place like Moldova, everyone feels they also have to prepare for the worst.
Michael, that's a great point to leave our conversation, albeit a sobering one. Thank you so much for joining me on Superpowers. It's been incredible to get your insight on everything from the Ukrainian democratic machinery all the way through to the future of the global world order. I'm James Heapy. This is Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. If you've liked what you've heard today, then subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel for more of Superpowers, but also more of the fantastic geopolitical analysis produced across the Times Radio channel. Until next week, thank you, goodbye.